The rich, dark scent of coffee filled the kitchen, a small, sacred ritual that anchored my mornings. It was the same brand Sarah had always bought, a little piece of her I refused to let go. The sun was just beginning to warm the old maple tree outside the window, casting long, gentle shadows across the linoleum floor she'd picked out 40 summers ago. This was my sanctuary. The quiet hum of the brewer was the only sound, a peaceful soundtrack to a life I'd carefully rebuilt from grief. And then the silence shattered. Chloe's footsteps were sharp and purposeful on the floor, a sound that had become increasingly common over the last few months. I didn't turn around, hoping she was just getting a glass of water, but she stopped directly behind me. I felt her presence like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. Then came the sound, a crisp, percussive slap of paper on the Formica countertop next to my mug. I finally turned, my movements slow, deliberate. There it was. A spreadsheet, printed in stark black and white, columns and rows, numbers and categories. It looked so clinical, so cold. "It's time we split the household expenses fairly," Chloe declared, her voice like shaved ice. There was no preamble, no softening of the blow. It was a statement of fact, delivered from a place of what she clearly believed was unassailable logic. My eyes drifted from the paper to her face. Her expression was set, her jaw tight. There was a glint of triumph in her eyes, the look of someone who has finally mustered the courage to lay down the law. "Groceries, utilities, internet," she continued, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the paper. "I've itemized it all for the last 3 months. You owe me $847.50. The number hung in the air between us, absurd and venomous. $847.50. It wasn't the amount, it was the sheer breathtaking audacity of it. My gaze shifted past her to my son, Mark. He was standing a few feet behind his wife, a sentinel of shame. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was studying his own feet as if he'd just discovered some fascinating new species of footwear. His shoulders were slumped, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was a ghost in his own life, letting his wife speak for him, fight his battles, insult his father. A cold void opened in my chest, right where my heart was supposed to be. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a profound, disorienting shock, like being plunged into icy water. I looked from Chloe's defiant face to Mark's downturned head, and then my eyes swept the room. This kitchen, the small chip in the countertop from when Mark, as a boy, had tried to help me fix the garbage disposal. The faint watermark on the ceiling from the leaky pipe we'd tackled together the year Sarah got sick. Every scuff and scratch was a memory, a stitch in the fabric of our family. And this woman, this stranger my son had married, was standing in the heart of that history, in the home my wife and I had built with love and sacrifice, with laughter and tears, reducing it all to a line item, reducing me to a debtor. The air felt thin, difficult to draw into my lungs. The familiar scent of coffee now seemed cloying, suffocating. This was more than a demand for money. It was an eviction notice on my peace, a renunciation of every unspoken rule of family and home. It was an insult delivered with the cold precision of a spreadsheet in the one place I had always felt safe. And in that moment, standing in the quiet morning light of the kitchen Sarah had loved, the breath was truly stolen from my body. The quiet here has a different texture than the quiet of my old office. That was a sterile silence, broken by the hum of servers and the distant tap-tap-tapping of keyboards, a silence full of waiting. This silence is full of living. It's the soft sigh of the old oak floorboards settling in the afternoon sun, the whisper of the willow tree outside the kitchen window, a sound Sarah always loved. This house breathes, and after 40 years, I know its every rhythm. We bought this place with stars in our eyes and a terrifying mortgage. Sarah saw the potential behind the peeling wallpaper, and the overgrown garden. I saw the solid bones, the good neighborhood, the investment. It was the first of many projects we'd tackled together. She was the vision. I was the foundation. I built a career on foundations, not of concrete and steel, though I dealt with plenty of that, but of numbers, of clauses, of unassailable logic. For 35 years, I was a commercial real estate developer and property manager. My world was contracts thicker than your thumb, cold-eyed valuations, and the intricate, often brutal dance of tenant law. I knew how to structure a deal that would survive a recession, and how to navigate an eviction that would leave the other party with no legal leg to stand on. They called me a lot of things in those boardrooms, some of them polite. But here, in this house, Sarah and I made a home. That man doesn't exist. To my son, Mark, to his wife, Chloe, to my grandchildren, when they visit, I am just Grandpa. I am the gentle old man in a worn-out flannel shirt who putters in his vegetable garden, who can tell you the exact day the tomatoes will be ripe. I am the one who tells long, rambling stories about the old days that I can see their eyes glaze over during I am a source of free babysitting, a soft touch for a loan, a relic of a quieter time, and I have loved playing that part. After a lifetime of high-stakes negotiations and constant pressure, the simplicity of being Grandpa has been a balm for my soul. It's why, when Mark showed up at my door 3 years ago, his shoulders slumped and his eyes shadowed with the shame of a sudden job loss, there was no question. "Just for a little while, Dad," he'd said, Chloe standing nervously behind him. "Just until we get back on our feet." Of course, I said yes. What father wouldn't? This house, which had once been so full of Sarah's laughter and the pitter-patter of a young Mark's feet, had grown too large and too quiet for just one man. Their presence filled a void I hadn't even fully acknowledged. So they moved into the large guest room upstairs. I cooked big meals, enjoying the noise and the chaos. I told them not to worry about rent, to save their money, to focus on finding their footing. A few months, I thought, 6 at most, but a few months turned into a year. The job search became less urgent. Chloe started working part-time from home, her laptop set up at the kitchen table. Mark picked up some freelance work. Life developed a new comfortable pattern. The temporary arrangement quietly, without any discussion, became permanent. And I was happy truly. I saw the relief in my son's face, the way the constant worry line between his brows began to fade. I enjoyed having family around. I'd come in from the garden with a basket of zucchini and hear Chloe on a business call, her voice sharp and efficient, and it made me smile. This was what family was for. This was what this house was for. It was my sanctuary, and I was sharing it. The man who once managed multi-million-dollar property portfolios now derived his greatest satisfaction from a perfectly weeded flower bed and the sound of his family living under his roof, safe and secure. I had hung up my suit and tie for good, or so I thought. I had retired not just from a job, but from a certain way of thinking, the strategic, calculating, always preparing for a fight part of my brain. I was just Grandpa, puttering in his garden, blissfully unaware that the foundation of my peaceful world was about to be tested. The spreadsheet was just the opening shot, the first crack in the foundation of the life I'd known. I thought maybe it was a moment of frustration, a bad day. I was a fool. It started subtly. A week after the kitchen confrontation, I went to mail a letter to an old friend and found the stack of bills on the hall table was gone. I didn't think much of it until the next day when I saw Chloe at the front door, taking a thick envelope from the mailman. She didn't meet my eye as she walked past, straight to their bedroom. The water bill, the electric, the gas, they were all being redirected. Her name was on them now. It was a quiet administrative coup. She wasn't just contributing, She was seizing control of the utilities, the very lifeblood of the house. It felt less like a shared responsibility and more like a hostile takeover of a functioning government. Then came the pantry. I came home from the grocery store one Tuesday, my arms laden with the usual bags, milk, bread, the specific brand of coffee Sarah had always loved. I went to put the cans of soup away and found it. A bright, brash, new brass lock on the pantry door. I actually stood there for a full minute, one hand on a can of tomato soup, just staring at it. The cold metallic glint of it in the soft kitchen light was an obscenity. This was the pantry where I'd stored baby food for Mark, where Sarah had kept her baking supplies, the shelves fragrant with the vanilla and cinnamon. It was a place of abundance, of family, and now it was locked. I found a note taped to it, written in Chloe's sharp, efficient handwriting. To avoid confusion and ensure fairness with grocery costs, Mark and I will be managing our own food storage from now on. My own food storage, in my own pantry, in my own house. The next time I saw the pantry open, it was a foreign land. My familiar cans of beans, my boxes of pasta, my jar of peanut butter, all gone. In their place were Chloe's organic, gluten-free artisanal products, quinoa in glass jars, kale chips, expensive-looking crackers. It was a declaration there was her food, and there was my food. There was her domain, and there was whatever was left for me. The notes began to appear everywhere. They were like little paper landmines waiting for me in the morning. Taped to the bathroom mirror, a 5-minute shower uses approximately 10 gallons of water. Please be mindful. Left on the coffee maker, this machine draws significant phantom power. Unplug when not in use. On the thermostat, which she had now password protected with a plastic cover, the optimal temperature for energy conservation is 68 degrees. We will not be adjusting it. Each note was a tiny incision, a paper cut to my soul. They weren't just about electricity or water. They were accusations. They screamed that I was wasteful, that I was a drain, that I was a burden in the home I had paid for, maintained, and loved for 4 decades. The words started to come out of her mouth too, no longer just on paper. I was reading the newspaper in the living room one evening, the soft rustle of the pages, the only sound. "You know, the daily paper is a luxury," Chloe said from the doorway, not even looking at me as she scrolled through her phone. "A completely unnecessary expense. You can get all that news online for free." I didn't look up. I like the feel of the paper. "It's financially irresponsible," she stated, her tone flat and final, as if she were reading from a corporate policy manual. "It's a waste of money we all have to live with." We. There was that word again, the royal we. She had folded me into her collective of financial mismanagement. I was the problem they had to live with, the burden. Mark would sometimes slink into the room after one of these exchanges, his shoulders perpetually hunched, a permanent apology etched onto his face. "Dad, look, I'm sorry," he'd whisper, his voice barely audible. She's under a lot of pressure. You know how she gets about budgets." "It's my house, Mark," I'd say, my voice weary. I know. Just try to keep the lights off when you leave a room, okay? For me?" His apologies were worse than her aggression. They were a betrayal of a different kind. He was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike on the very driveway outside, the young man I'd welcomed into this home, rent-free without a second thought. And now he was her lieutenant, asking me to scuttle around in the dark in my own home to appease his wife. The peaceful rhythm of my life, the gentle cadence I had built around Sarah's memory, was being systematically dismantled. Every locked door, every passive-aggressive note, every uttered criticism was another brick removed. The garden felt less vibrant. The old movies I watched felt hollow. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, charged with a cold domestic war. I was living in a fortress that was being occupied from the inside, and the invaders were my own family. I was becoming a ghost in my own home, tiptoeing around, hyper-aware of every flush of the toilet, every flip of a light switch, waiting for the next note, the next comment, the next little piece of my world to be taken from me. The light from the television screen was the only thing illuminating the room, casting long, blue-tinged shadows across the familiar furniture. It was a Sunday, just past 3 in the afternoon, a time slot Sarah and I had claimed as our own for more than 30 years. The movie was an old one, a black-and-white comedy we'd seen a dozen times, its rhythms as comforting as a favorite sweater. I was in my chair, her empty one beside me, a blanket over my legs, not because I was cold, but because the weight of it felt like a presence. This was our ritual. It was sacred ground in the landscape of my week, a small, quiet island of peace in the house that held a lifetime of memories. The sound of her footsteps on the hardwood floor was sharp, intrusive. I didn't need to look to know it was Chloe. Mark's steps were heavier, more hesitant. Hers were always purposeful, a quick, clipped rhythm that announced her arrival like a warning. I kept my eyes on the screen, on the actor delivering a line I knew by heart, hoping my silence would be a wall she wouldn't breach. But she walked right up to the television stand, her silhouette blocking the picture. Her hand, with its perfectly manicured nails, reached out and picked up the remote from the arm of my chair. She didn't ask. She didn't explain. There was just the soft, final click. The room plunged into a silence so profound it felt physical. The faint hum of the electronics vanished. The familiar voices and the orchestral score were gone, severed in an instant. The only light now was the dull grey of the late afternoon filtering through the blinds, painting the room in shades of ash and dust. I finally turned my head to look at her. She was standing there, holding the remote at her side like a scepter she had every right to wield. The electricity bill was astronomical last month, she stated. Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion except a cold, clinical disapproval. It was the tone a property manager might use with a delinquent tenant. No more unnecessary usage. This isn't a hotel. She didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and walked out, her footsteps receding down the hall toward the kitchen. The sound of the refrigerator door opening and closing echoed in the new, oppressive quiet. And I was left there, in the chair, in the dark, in the house I built. For a long moment, there was nothing, no thought, no feeling, just a vast, hollow emptiness where the movie's warmth had been. My gaze drifted from the blank dark screen to the empty chair beside me. I could almost see Sarah there, her head tilted back in a laugh at the same silly joke, her hand reaching for the popcorn bowl we always shared. This wasn't just a room, this was our sanctuary. This was where we'd weathered storms, celebrated victories, and simply existed together in comfortable, loving silence. This ritual was a thread connecting me to her, a weekly visit to a time when the world made sense. And Chloe had just severed that thread with a single, contemptuous click. The silence in the room began to change. It was no longer just an absence of sound. It became a presence. It pressed in on my eardrums, heavy and demanding. It was in that silence that I heard it, not a sound, but a feeling. A deep tectonic shift within myself. It started as a low heat in the pit of my stomach, a simmering ember fanned into a sudden fierce glow, the gentle, accommodating grandfather they all saw, the man who putted in the garden, who nodded and smiled, who paid the mortgage and the taxes without complaint so his son and daughter-in-law could save money. That man began to recede. He was a costume I had worn for their benefit, and it had become threadbare. In his place something else stirred, something that had been sleeping for a long, long time. It was the part of me that had walked into contentious boardrooms and commanded silence with a look, the part that had analyzed complex property portfolios, identified weaknesses in ironclad contracts, and negotiated multi-million-dollar deals where the stakes were everything. They called me the Kingmaker. Not because I was a king, but because I understood the architecture of power, the assets, the liabilities, the leverage. I built empires from empty lots and legal precedent. Chloe, with her spreadsheets and her locked pantry and her petty cruel notes, thought she was dealing with a feeble old man. She thought this was a squabble over a few $100s and a television show. She had no concept of the scale of her error. She didn't see the battlefield she had just chosen, my home, my asset, the one I had poured my life into, not just with money, but with love and memory. She had declared war on my sanctuary, and in the profound clarifying silence she left behind, the general finally woke up. The sleeping lion opened its eyes. And it was not old, it was not gentle, it was hungry. The silence in my study was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the empty silence of a lonely house. It was the focused, humming silence of a command center before a major operation. The click of the television, the echo of Chloe's final dismissive words, they had faded, replaced by a low, thrumming energy that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards, from the leather of my old chair, from the spines of the law books that lined the walls. I ran my fingers over the polished mahogany of my desk, a surface Sarah had always said was too large, too imposing for a home. Tonight it felt just right. For 3 years I had allowed a version of myself to exist, the gentle grandfather, the puttering gardener, the man defined by his loss and his willingness to accommodate. I had folded that man up like a well-worn coat and put him on every morning. But that coat was off now, hanging on a phantom hook in the corner of the room. In its place, I felt the familiar, almost forgotten weight of a different mantle. I didn't feel like a frail old man sinking into the cushions of his chair. I felt my spine straighten, my shoulders square. I felt the ghost of my own past rise up and inhabit me once more. I felt like the Kingmaker. The name came back to me not as a boast, but as a simple statement of fact. They'd called me that in the boardrooms of Denver, not because I was the flashiest developer, but because I was the one who made the deals that built empires for others. I was the architect of fortunes, the quiet force behind the glossy brochures and ribbon cuttings, and it all started right here in rooms like this, with the raw materials of paper, precedent, and pure, unadulterated strategy. I closed my eyes, and the memories weren't hazy or nostalgic. They were crisp and technical, like blueprints being unrolled in my mind. I saw myself, 30 years younger, drafting a commercial lease agreement for a flagship store in a new shopping complex. It wasn't just a document. It was a labyrinth of clauses and contingencies, a work of art designed to protect my client's asset for the next 2 decades. I remember the precise language I'd used to account for everything from maintenance responsibilities to the specific type of signage permitted, leaving no room for ambiguity, no loophole for a tenant to exploit. I could feel the weight of the pen in my hand, the certainty in every stroke. Then another memory surfaced, a market analysis for a prime, undeveloped parcel of land by the river. I hadn't just looked at comparable sales, I had dissected the city's future development plans, projected traffic flow patterns for the next 10 years, analyzed the demographic shifts in the surrounding neighborhoods. I had valued not just the dirt, but its potential, its future. I had seen the ghost of a skyscraper in an empty field and put a dollar figure on its soul and the eviction proceedings. I handled those with a cold, surgical precision that sometimes kept me up at night. Even then, it was never personal. It was a simple matter of contract law. A tenant would stop paying, thinking they could outlast some sentimental old corporation. They didn't understand that they weren't dealing with a person. They were dealing with a system I had designed. I would methodically assemble the paper trail, the notices, the records of non-payment. I would present it all with an unshakable, calm finality. In a sterile courtroom, I wasn't evicting a family. I was executing a clause. I was balancing a ledger. Chloe, in her petty, spreadsheet-wielding arrogance, thought this was about $847.50. She saw a line item for groceries and utilities. She saw a frail old man who loved his garden and his old movies. She had no concept of the scale of her error. She hadn't asked for a share of the bills. She had declared war on a master of assets and liabilities. She had challenged a man who spent his entire professional life understanding that everything, a building, a piece of land, a relationship, has a value, and that value is defined by the strength of the agreement that governs it. And in the profound, humming silence of my study, a plan began to form. It didn't arrive in a flash of anger or a surge of emotion. It unfolded piece by perfect, ruthless piece, like the terms of an ironclad contract. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. It wasn't about getting even. It was about re-establishing the fundamental principles of ownership and tenancy. It was about speaking a language she would finally understand, the cold, hard language of the ledger. A slow, grim smile touched my lips, one that hadn't been there in years. The sleeping lion wasn't just awake. He was calculating his prey's every move, and he was about to change the entire game. The door to my study clicked shut, and for the first time in 3 years it felt like more than just a room. It felt like a command center. The air was different in here, thick with the scent of old leather and the faint metallic tang of the desktop computer I hadn't powered on in years. This wasn't the place where a grandfather came to reminisce. This was the place where the Kingmaker went to work. For a full week, I lived in that room. The world outside, the sound of Chloe in the kitchen, the drone of the television she now controlled, faded into a distant hum. I was tunneling, not into anger, but into data, cold, hard, irrefutable numbers. My old briefcase, scarred and supple, yielded its treasures. A leather-bound ledger from my final project, a thumb drive with templates I'd crafted over a lifetime. My hands, which had felt so useless holding that ridiculous spreadsheet, now flew across the keyboard with a muscle memory I hadn't realized I still possessed. Step 1 was the foundation. I started with the property records, pulling the deed for this very house. I'd bought it with Sarah for a song 40 years ago, a fixer-upper in a neighborhood everyone had written off. Now it was prime real estate. I cross-referenced the county's online database, confirming the lot size, the square footage, the tax assessment. Every figure was a brick, laid with precision. Then came the rental comps. I spent hours on real estate sites, not looking at dream homes, but analyzing the market with a predator's eye. What was a room in a comparable, fully furnished home in this zip code worth? Not a cheap room in a student flophouse, but a proper room in a well-maintained, prime location property like mine. The numbers came in, a range from $1,500 to $2,000 a month. I settled on $1,600. It was fair, it was defensible, it was devastating. With the monthly rate established, the real architecture began. Step 2 was the invoice. I opened a fresh document and chose a font called Garamond. It looked professional, unemotional, the kind of typeface used for court documents and corporate mergers. At the top, I created a letterhead, my name, my address, and beneath it a single stark line: property management and invoicing. The line items were a work of art. I didn't just write back rent. I itemized it: residential tenancy, room and board, 36 months at $1,600 per month. The total was a number that made my own breath catch for a second: $57,000. $600. But I wasn't finished. A tenant doesn't just pay rent. They contribute to the costs of maintaining the asset. I pulled out my files for the last 3 years. I calculated the prorated share of the property taxes, dividing the annual bill by 3 occupants. I did the same for the homeowner's insurance premium. Then came maintenance. I estimated the annual cost of upkeep for a house of this age: roof, HVAC, plumbings, landscaping. I prorated that too. I added each line item with a calm, methodical click of the mouse. The subtotal grew. The final number, when I typed it out at the bottom, was $58,400. I looked at it for a long time. It was no longer a number. It was a statement. It was the quantified value of their audacity, the monetary representation of every locked pantry and passive-aggressive note. Step 3 was the cover letter. This was where the language had to be perfect. It couldn't sound like a hurt father. It had to read like a memo from a boardroom to the occupants, Mark and Chloe. It began, "No, dear son, no familial terms." This letter serves as a formal summary of the tenancy agreement, implied by your continuous residence at the above address for the 36-month period concluding with the date of this notice. I outlined the terms, stating that their occupancy had constituted a month-to-month tenancy at the prevailing fair market rate. I cited the data I'd compiled, the comparable rental analyses, the shared cost calculations. I presented the attached invoice not as a punishment, but as a settlement for housing services rendered, a standard practice in resolving accounts for past due obligations. The tone was dry, legalese, and utterly unassailable. It was a language Chloe had tried to speak with her petty spreadsheet, but this was the real thing. This was the mother tongue. On the 7th day, I hit print. The printer, an old workhorse, whirred to life and began spitting out the pages I used, heavy linen weave paper, the kind that feels important in your hands. I made 3 copies, one for Chloe, one for Mark, one for my files, to be placed in a fresh folder labeled simply "The Residence." I slid each set of documents into a crisp white business envelope. On Chloe's, I wrote her name in my most formal script. On Mark's, I did the same. I felt no triumph, only a profound and quiet certainty. The chessboard was set. The pieces were in place. All that was left was to make the move. I placed the 2 envelopes on the corner of my desk and went to make dinner, knowing that when we sat down to eat, the dynamic in this house was going to change forever. The sound of the envelope tearing open was sharp in the quiet of the dining room. Chloe did it with a flourish, that little smirk playing on her lips. I could see the anticipation in her eyes, the certainty that she was about to be handed a check, her victory complete. For a moment there was just the rustle of high-quality bond paper. Then her eyes started moving, scanning down the page. The smirk didn't just fade, it was wiped from her face as if by a physical force. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving a sickly pale canvas. Her fingers, which had been so confident, began to tremble. "This." The word was a choked whisper. She blinked hard, as if trying to clear a hallucination. "This is a joke." Her voice climbed, thin and reedy. $58,400. The number hung in the air, a tangible, suffocating presence. It was a sum that commanded silence. Mark, who had been staring at his plate, his usual posture of shameful deference, snapped his head up. His jaw literally dropped, his mouth agape in pure, unadulterated shock. He looked from Chloe's horrified face to the paper in her hand, then to me. And in that moment I let the mask fall, completely. I didn't move from my chair. I didn't raise my voice. I simply turned my gaze to Chloe, and I knew what she saw. She wasn't looking at the gentle grandfather who puttered in the garden and got misty-eyed at old movies. She was looking into the eyes of the man who had stared down corporate lawyers across boardroom tables, the man who had negotiated 7-figure leases without breaking a sweat, the man they used to call the Kingmaker. The warmth was gone, replaced by a calm, analytical coldness that had been my most potent weapon for 3 decades. "No," I said, my voice level and steady, a rock in the turbulent sea of her panic. "It's an invoice for 36 months of unpaid rent, property taxes, homeowners insurance, and a prorated share of estimated maintenance costs for this property." I gestured casually toward the document, as if pointing out a minor clause in a standard agreement. "The current fair market rental rate for a single room in a furnished, prime location property like this is quite clearly laid out on page 2. I've used a conservative estimate, frankly. I was a property manager for 30 years, Chloe. I know how to value an asset." I let the word asset land with its full, dehumanizing weight. She had tried to turn my home, my sanctuary, my last connection to Sarah, into a ledger of petty expenses. So I had shown her what a real ledger looked like. I had taken the very concept of fair share she had weaponized and forged it into a blade of breathtaking proportions. Her eyes were wide, darting across the document, searching for a flaw, a loophole, anything. She saw the official-looking letterhead, the itemized breakdowns, the citations of local rental market reports, the cold, hard math that was unassailable. This wasn't an old man's rant. This was a professional assessment, a bill of lading for 3 years of their lives. Her gaze finally lifted from the paper and locked with mine. The anger was still there, a flicker in the depths of her panic, but it was being drowned by a dawning, terrifying comprehension. She was finally seeing me, not the caricature she had built in her head, the financially irresponsible, doddering burden, but the titan, the strategist, the man who had spent the last week not fuming in silence, but meticulously building a trap with the very skills she had so foolishly dismissed. She had poked a lion, thinking it was a sleepy house cat, and now the lion was staring back, not with a roar, but with the silent, terrifying certainty of a predator that has already won. Her hand went limp, and the invoice fluttered down to the polished surface of the dining table. It landed with a soft whisper right next to her own printed spreadsheet. That single sheet of paper, with its demand for $847.50, looked exactly like what it was. A pathetic, amateurish scrap, a child's drawing next to a master's blueprint. It was insignificant, laughable, utterly forgotten, in the shadow of the mountain of debt she had just realized she had been accruing for 3 years. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was the sound of a worldview shattering into a million pieces. The silence that fell over the house was not the peaceful quiet I had cherished for so many years after Sarah passed. This was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, thick with the unspoken, charged with the aftershock of a seismic event. For 2 full days, the only sounds were the whisper of the central air and the cautious, padded footsteps of people trying to navigate a landscape that had fundamentally shifted beneath their feet. The first thing I noticed was the pantry. On the morning after I'd presented my invoice, the little brass lock was gone. The hasp was still there, a few small screw holes in the wood, a testament to its brief, hostile tenure, but the lock itself had vanished. Later that same day, I saw it in the kitchen trash can, nestled atop coffee grounds and eggshells, a small metallic corpse. The notes were next to disappear. The one taped to the microwave about peak hour energy surcharges was gone. The one on the thermostat, with its aggressively drawn arrow pointing to 68 degrees, had vanished. It was like watching an army in full retreat, abandoning its fortifications in a desperate, silent scramble. They stayed in their wing of the house, I stayed in mine. I made my own coffee, ate my own meals, and tended to my garden, the rich, dark soil, a comforting constant. I could feel their presence, a low hum of anxiety radiating through the walls. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, just this profound, waiting silence. I didn't push. A siege, after all, is won by patience as much as by force. I had laid my terms on the table. The ball was in their court. On the morning of the third day, he came to me. I was in my study, not doing anything of consequence, just sitting in my worn leather chair, the one that had molded itself to my shape over decades. The door was open. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, hesitating, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a boy waiting outside the principal's office, not a man of 40 years. "Dad?" His voice was soft, stripped of all the false confidence his wife had tried to instill in him. "Mark." I didn't gesture for him to come in. I simply acknowledged him. This was his move to make. He stepped inside, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't look at the framed photographs on the wall. Him as a gap-toothed kid on my shoulders, our family at the beach, Sarah laughing in the sun. His eyes were fixed on the floor between us. We got your invoice," he began, stating the obvious as if hoping the words themselves would build a bridge. "I assumed you had," I replied, my voice level. The Kingmaker was present in the room, but so was the father. It was a delicate balance. He finally lifted his head, and I saw the raw shame in his eyes. It wasn't the performative shame of being caught. It was the deep, gut-wrenching kind that comes from realizing you have failed in a fundamental way. "We can't pay it, Dad. There's no way. $58,000. We don't have that. We'll never have that." He looked utterly defeated, a man who had seen the cliff's edge and knew he was about to fall. This was the moment. This was the pivot point I had engineered this entire operation to reach. The invoice was never about the money. It was a tool, a psychological lever. It was the language they had chosen to speak, and I had simply proven I was fluent in a far more advanced dialect. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and looked at my son, truly looked at him, not as an adversary, but as my flawed, misguided boy. "I know you can't pay it, Mark." The confusion on his face was almost painful to see. "Then, why? Why give it to us?" "To make you understand the true value of what you've been given," I said, my voice dropping into the calm, steady tone I used to use when closing a multi-million-dollar deal. "You and Chloe came into my home, the home your mother and I built, and you tried to turn it into a transaction. You itemized groceries, you metered kindness, you tried to make me a tenant in my own castle." I let the words hang in the air between us, let them sink in. He flinched, but he didn't look away. He was finally listening. "So here is my offer," I said, and I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes, bracing for another impossible demand. "The invoice for $58,400 is voided. Tear it up. It ceases to exist." The relief that washed over him was so immediate and so profound, it was like watching a man take his first breath after being underwater. His shoulders loosened. He almost swayed on his feet. "But," I continued, and he stiffened again, "it is voided on one condition." "Anything, Dad. Just name it." "You and Chloe will sit down with me, and you will both sign a formal, legally binding 1-year lease agreement for your rooms in this house." His brow furrowed. "A lease, but we can't afford." I held up a hand. "You will pay a nominal rent of $1 for the entire year." Now he just looked bewildered. $1? $1, I confirmed. "The lease will outline your rights and responsibilities as tenants. It will grant you the legal protections of tenants, but it will also formally establish my rights and responsibilities as your landlord. It will state in unambiguous legal language that this is my property, that I set the rules, that my authority here is absolute." I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly, and you will never, ever question my authority in my own home again. Is that understood? He didn't hesitate. He didn't need to consult his wife. The lesson had been learned, seared into him by the sheer, terrifying scale of the debt from which he was being reprieved. Yes, he breathed out, the word carrying the weight of his surrender and his gratitude. Yes, Dad, we understand, we agree, thank you. He turned and left the study, his steps quicker, lighter. The silence that returned was different now. The heavy, anxious weight was gone. In its place was a new quiet, one of order, of understanding, of a peace that had been hard-won and would, I knew, be lasting. The power dynamic, so violently upended, had not just been righted. It had been permanently and peacefully restored. The lion had roared, and now he could return to his rest. The morning sun feels different now. It's the same light that used to filter through the kitchen window when Sarah was here, but for the first time in years, it feels warm on my skin instead of just illuminating the empty space she left behind. 6 months. It's been 6 months since I handed my son and his wife that invoice, and the silence that followed was the most profound sound I'd ever heard. It wasn't the silence of defeat or anger, it was the sound of a foundation being reset. I take my coffee out to the back porch, the mug warm in my hands. The garden is thriving. My tomatoes are heavy on the vine, the rosemary bush is fragrant and wild, and the hydrangeas Sarah planted 40 years ago are a riot of blue and pink. This was always our sanctuary. Now it's mine again. I can hear the faint, considerate sounds of life inside the house. The soft click of a cupboard closing, not a slam, the murmur of a conversation, not a heated argument. It's a gentle hum, a rhythm that fits the house instead of fighting against it. Mark comes out sometimes, early before he leaves for work. He'll stand with his own mug, and we'll just look at the garden. We don't talk about the invoice, or the lease, or the 2 days of stunned silence that followed my presentation. We talk about the weather, about the Cardinals game, about a memory of his mother. It's simple, it's easy, and in that ease I see the son I remember, the one who got lost for a little while, buried under someone else's ambition and his own fear. He looks at me now, and I don't see guilt or resentment. I see respect, the kind of respect that isn't demanded but earned, the kind a man has for his father. Chloe is different too. The hardness around her eyes has softened. The militant efficiency is still there, but it's been redirected. She handles the grocery shopping now, but it's not a power play. Last week she came home and, without a word, put a new bag of my favorite dark roast coffee beans on the counter. It was such a small thing, but in this house it was a monument. It was an acknowledgement. She sees the structure now. She understands that this home isn't an asset to be managed, but a legacy to be honored. She and Mark contribute without being asked, not out of obligation, but as partners in maintaining the peace we've all fought so hard to reclaim. In the evenings, I retreat to my study. The room smells of old books and lemon polish, just as it always has. But on the wall, right next to my diploma and a faded photograph of Sarah and me on our wedding day, hangs a new piece of art. It's the lease agreement, professionally matted and framed behind non-glare glass. People might find it strange, framing a legal document. But they'd be missing the point. It's not the words on the page that matter, it's the story they tell. The $1 clause isn't a price tag, it's a symbol. It's the period at the end of a very long, very difficult sentence. It represents the moment I stopped being Grandpa, the gentle pushover, and became the patriarch again, the head of this family, the keeper of this home. Sometimes my fingers trace the glass over my signature. I don't feel a surge of victory or pride, I feel a deep, abiding sense of peace. That document wasn't a weapon of destruction, it was a tool of creation. It built a new understanding. It drew a line in the sand that everyone could see and, more importantly, agreed to honor. Last Sunday, I was in the living room watching an old Cary Grant movie, the same one Chloe had turned off months before. She walked in, and for a split second I saw a flicker of the old tension in her posture, but then she just smiled slightly. "I always liked this one," she said, and she sat down in the armchair across from me. We watched the rest of the film in a comfortable silence. The room wasn't dark and hostile. It was warm, filled with the flickering light of the screen and the shared, unspoken agreement that this was my time, in my home. This new equilibrium isn't fragile. It's strong because it was forged in truth, not in pretense. They see me for who I am, not just the old man puttering in the garden, but the man who built a life here, brick by brick, memory by memory. A man who knows the value of an asset, yes, but more importantly, the priceless weight of a home. And I can finally enjoy it all again. My garden, my movies, my peace, knowing that what is mine is once again respected. The lion is silent once more, but everyone in the kingdom now understands the nature of his roar. For 36 years, I built my career on a simple principle. Everything has a value. I could look at an empty plot of land and see not just dirt and potential, but its exact worth down to the dollar. I could dissect a lease agreement and find the single clause that would protect my client or sink the other party. I lived in a world of numbers, of contracts, of cold, hard facts. But I always came home to something that had no price tag. I came home to my family, to Sarah, to the life we built in these four walls. That was the one ledger I never opened. That was the one account I thought was immune from the brutal arithmetic of the outside world. Respect in a family is not a transaction. You don't put it on a spreadsheet. You don't itemize it. It's the quiet understanding over a morning coffee. It's the unspoken agreement to care for one another. It's the foundation. It's the load-bearing wall that holds the entire structure up. When Chloe slapped that first invoice on my counter, she wasn't just asking for $847.50. She was trying to drill into that foundation. She was trying to replace the mortar of mutual care with the cheap cement of a business deal. And once you do that, the whole house becomes unstable. But here's what she, and so many others, fail to understand. When someone tries to turn your home, your sanctuary, your last connection to a life you loved, into a ledger, you have to remind them who holds the pen. For months I was silent. I was the gentle grandpa puttering in the garden. I was the frail old man who just wanted to watch his movies. I let them believe that. I let them see the lion napping in the sun. They mistook that silence for weakness. They mistook my patience for passivity. They thought they were dealing with a man who had forgotten his own strength. They were wrong. I didn't get tough. Getting tough is emotional. It's shouting. It's slamming doors. It's the reaction they expect from an old man being pushed too far. That's a battle fought on their terms, in the mud of their own making. I didn't do that. I got precise. I retreated to my study, the one place in this house that still felt like my old office, and I became the Kingmaker. Again, I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, clear focus. I wasn't fighting my daughter-in-law. I was solving a problem of asset management. My home was the asset, her behavior was the liability. My response had to be the perfect, surgical countermove. I didn't get angry, I got even. But even doesn't mean revenge. In the world I came from, getting even means restoring balance. It means correcting a miscalculation in the market. My invoice for $58,400 wasn't revenge. It was a market correction. It was me speaking the only language she seemed to understand fluently, the language of cold, hard, inarguable value. I presented her with a ledger so vast, so meticulously documented, that her little spreadsheet looked like a child's scribble. I didn't yell, I didn't demand. I simply presented the facts. And in that presentation, the entire power dynamic of this house shifted irrevocably. Never, ever mistake a lion's silence for weakness. The lion is silent because he is secure. He knows his strength. He knows the reach of his claws and the power of his roar. He conserves his energy for the moment that truly matters. My silence during those months of petty notes and locked pantries wasn't weakness. It was conservation. It was observation. I was learning her tactics, understanding her mindset, and waiting for the perfect moment to demonstrate, once and for all, who truly ruled this particular stretch of the savannah. The framed lease in my study, with its $1 a year clause, isn't a trophy of my victory. It's a treaty. It's a document that now defines our relationship with a perfect clarity. It reminds all of us that this is my house, my rules, my domain. But it also reminds me that the most powerful contracts are not the ones written on paper, but the ones written in mutual respect. They finally learned that. And I was reminded that the man I was in the boardrooms, the strategist, the evaluator, the kingmaker, he never really left. He was just waiting in the wings patiently for the day his family needed to be reminded that the gentlest hand can still hold the mightiest pen.